Morning. I am not a news junkie. Like I don't have the breaking news alerts come to my phone, and I'm not a guy who sits around and watches hours upon hours of cable news. But one of the things I do like to do is at least a couple times a week, there are a couple websites that I'll go to, and I will just sort of read through the headlines. And normally, what happens for me is once you get past the like political drama and the celebrity gossip, there's usually at least one or two headlines that will cause me to think, that sounds interesting. I'd like to know more about that. And so I'll click. So just for an example, this past week I saw several. There was one that said this: Chinese zoo says our bears are real, not humans in disguise. Now to me, that sounds a lot more interesting than what somebody in Washington, D.C. or Frankfurt had to say this week. There's another one that said, Atlanta man attempts to rob nail salon, gets ignored by everyone. And I want you to listen to one line from the article. Here's what it said. On the surveillance footage, you can see the unidentified suspect with his hand in a bag as if he were holding a weapon storm into the Nail First salon last Monday demanding money. Although the man shouted, "Everybody get down, give me all your money," the footage shows he was ignored by both customers and employees. And what's so cool about that, you could actually watch the video. That's a pretty good description of it. And then there was this one: long overdue book returned to Massachusetts Library 119 years later. And some of you may have seen this next one. Texas woman mowing lawn attacked by snake and hawk at the same time. And I'll be honest, I was afraid to read that one, so I did not click on it. So if you know what that's about, you can fill me in later. Of all the headlines, though, that I read this past week, there was one that captured my attention more than any other, and I took a screenshot of it so I could share it with you. Here's what it says. Leprosy may now be endemic in Florida, report suggests. The article tells the story of a 54-year-old man with no known risk factors who had never traveled outside the state of Florida, somehow winding up with what's called Hansen's disease or leprosy, which is a skin-eating bacterial infection. And since he was diagnosed, researchers have discovered that 81% of all national leprosy diagnoses come from this one region in Central Florida. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd always assumed that leprosy was like a lot of other diseases and that it had been eradicated over the years. But that's not true, or at least it's not true in that part of Florida. The good news about it, though, and if you read the article, you'll discover this, is that it can now be treated. So you go to the doctor, you get an antibiotic, you get some steroid cream, and hopefully it all clears up for you. But officials warn that if it's left untreated, it can spread throughout a person's body and leave them permanently disabled or physically disfigured. There was one line in the article that I thought was especially insightful. Here's what it said. The physical changes associated with the disease can also lead to enduring stigmatization and isolation of the infected people. Now, if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 5. This morning, we're in week 2 of this series that we're calling Roof Crashers, and we're looking at 4 different scenes from this one chapter that, when taken together, form kind of an origin story of the church. Now, you have to remember, when we read the Bible, normally we try to piecemeal it together and look at different stories individually, but when Luke's original audience would have heard this, they would have heard it collectively. Somebody would sit in front of the room where they would all gather. They would read through the entire Gospel of Luke in one setting, and so they would hear the whole thing rather than just bits and pieces, which changes the way you understand the story. And if you were here last weekend, we looked at this opening scene in Luke chapter 5 in which Jesus invites a guy named Peter, along with his brother Andrew, and 2 of his closest friends, James and John, to leave behind their commercial fishing operation and come and follow after him. Luke 5:11 sort of summarizes, it says this, it says, so they pulled up on the shore, left everything, including this huge pile of fish they had just caught, and they followed him. From there, they then go out on this tour of the region of Galilee, which is where they were all from, And the region, sort of this region's got all these little towns and villages, and they were just sort of popping in from one town to the next town or one village to the next village, where they go to one particular village where they encounter this guy that is suffering with leprosy. So if you have your Bible open, I want you to look at the first part of verse 12 in Luke chapter 5. Here's what it says. It says, while Jesus was in one of those towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. Now, one of the mistakes we sometimes make, read the Bible, is that we tend to read it from our perspective, right? So we read about this guy that's covered with leprosy, and you might be tempted to think, well, that had to be frustrating, right? So here's what this guy needs to do. This guy needs to find a dermatologist, an infectious disease control doctor, get some antibiotics and some steroid cream, and get that stuff cleared up. That's the way we tend to think about it. But in the first century, that's not the way it worked. In the first century, rather than being like a temporary setback, a diagnosis of leprosy was almost a guaranteed death sentence. And long before a person died, once they were diagnosed, in order to stop the spread of the disease, they would be forced to leave their community, leave their home, where they would be exiled to spend the rest of their life in what was called a leper colony. So from that point forward, from the moment you were diagnosed until the moment you died, you could never do what you'd always done. You were essentially cut off from everybody you knew, everything you loved, and everything that made your life worth living. And then if you did have to just come back into town to maybe conduct some business, you had to cover your face, you had to keep a 6 to 10 foot distance from anybody that was around you, and you had to announce your arrival by repeatedly yelling the word unclean, unclean. So somebody with leprosy would wind up completely isolated. Eventually they'd be physically disabled, they'd be horrifically disfigured, they'd be impoverished because they would lose their job, and they would be depressed. Essentially, they were just cut off from life. That's why historians tell us that most people that had leprosy committed suicide long before they ever got to the end in hopes of avoiding their anticipated suffering. And that's what this guy in the story is dealing with. We don't know much about his situation, but we do know it's really bad, and he's looking for a way out. Go back to verse 12. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Now you go back to the end of Luke 4. Luke, who was a physician, which means he was intimately familiar with all kinds of these diseases, tells us that Jesus had been hanging out at Peter's house, and Peter's mother-in-law lived with Peter and his wife, and she'd come down with some unknown ailment that was causing her to have a high fever, and Jesus took it upon himself to bless the family, and he heals Peter's mother-in-law of this fever. Word of that gets out, and so you have all kinds of people with all kinds of problems who start showing up, hoping that Jesus will do for them what he did for Peter's mother-in-law, and that's exactly what he does. It says he heals all kinds of people, and so word of that has started to leak out. It started to spread, and it's very possible that this guy in Luke 5, this leper, has heard about what Jesus has done for other people, and he wants in on the action. He knows that the road in front of him looks really bad, and so he's looking for an escape hatch. So he hears about Jesus, and he goes and he finds him, and he says to him, Lord, if you're willing, you can solve this. You can fix this problem. You can cleanse me. And it's in response to that Jesus does three things that each in their own way demonstrate what a church is supposed to be. Remember, this all happens near the beginning of his public ministry, the early days, the ground floor of this thing that he's trying to build. And he's showing us what this whole thing is supposed to look like and how it's been designed to operate. So in your bulletin, if you want to keep track, I've called this the kind of church that can change a community. And if you're tracking with us, here's the first thing. A church that can change its community is a place where people are not just welcome, but they're actually wanted. I want you to look at how Jesus responds to this guy's request in verse 13. Here's what it says. Jesus reached out his hand and touch the man. I am willing, he said, be clean, and immediately the leprosy left him. Now, here's my question. Have you ever been somewhere where you were like technically welcome, but you weren't really wanted? You ever been to one of those places? You know how this works. This happened to us just this weekend. When I read this story of the guy in the nail salon, that kind of resonated with me, and maybe it did for you because you've had similar experiences, right? Hopefully you didn't try to rob anybody, but you know what I'm talking about. You walk in some business and you're there to spend your money, and the person who's, the salesperson, rather than making it a pleasant experience, either ignores you or acts like you're kind of an inconvenience. You ever had that experience? Or you go to a restaurant and you sit there for 20 minutes and the waiter doesn't come over. That happened to me this weekend. Very pleasant experience. Maybe you book a hotel online and you think it's going to be awesome, and you get there and there's nobody at the front desk and you don't know what to do, and you just stand there and you feel like a goofball because you're just sort of standing there. And what's so crazy about that is all of these places, if you think about it, like they invited you to come. You know what I mean? Like if you own a restaurant, if you own a store, if you're in the hotel business, you're not just inviting people to come. You're advertising for people to come. You're begging people to come. And then when they come, sometimes you act like they're an inconvenience. So it's like technically they're welcome, but they're not really wanted. Churches sometimes make the same mistake. We sometimes do the same thing. I've got a picture I want to show you. Some of you have seen this. This is a sign that hangs out on the outer wall of the sanctuary out in the lobby in Austin, and I put this up 3 or 4 years ago, which is a whole nother story in and of itself. I didn't cuss, but I think he did. No, he didn't. Here's what it says. At FCC, we live like everybody's welcome, nobody's perfect, and through Jesus, anything is possible. Now, we know, like, the last two of those statements are objectively true, right? We know nobody's perfect. If you think I hate to burst your bubble, but you're not. None of us are perfect. In fact, some of us are really messed up. We also know that third statement is true. Through Jesus, we believe anything is possible. If we didn't believe that, there'd be no reason for us to be here today. But what about the first one? I mean, every church says that, right? Every church says everybody's welcome. You drive around, you'll see that on the church sign. Everybody's welcome. Please come. Please visit. But sometimes in a church, just like in a business, that can come to mean something other than what it actually says. So if it was going to be more accurate, in some places it would have to say, instead of everybody's welcome, it would need to say, everybody who thinks like us and looks like us and generally fits in with us and worships like us is welcome. That's a lot to put on a sign, but that would be more accurate. And unless you fit into all those categories, you're welcome. I mean, you're welcome to come. We're not going to kick you out, but you're not really wanted. And in the case of this guy suffering with leprosy, you know who it was that exiled the lepers from the community? It was the religious people. You go back to Leviticus 13 and 14, you can read about that. And they thought they were doing the right thing. I mean, in order to stop the spread of the disease, they were convinced the only way to do that was to isolate people, to push them out, to make sure they stayed in their lane. In fact, they took their role in protecting the community so seriously that if one of these lepers was found to break one of those rules, the local rabbi would oversee the punishment, and everybody keep their distance, but they'd have this soldier with this mask who would deliver 39 lashes across their back as a reminder to them and all the other lepers that, hey, you're not really wanted here. But then Jesus shows up, and he turns that up on its head when he does something that they would never do. And he doesn't just speak to the leper. He actually reaches out and touches the leper. He reaches out and he touches somebody that's been labeled untouchable. And it's hard for us to imagine what this moment would have been like. I mean, here's this guy. He's had years of people avoiding him. Nobody's touched this guy for a really long time. And all of a sudden, Jesus reaches out and touches him. And what's so powerful about that is that Jesus didn't have to do that. You read through the Gospels, there are lots of examples of Jesus healing people that he never touched. All he had to do was just say the word. In fact, there's one story where Jesus heals this royal official's son from 20 miles away. And all he does is say the word, and the guy's healed. And Jesus could have done that here, but he doesn't do that. Instead, he reaches out and he touches this guy. Why does he do that? He wants this guy to know that he's not just welcome, he's actually wanted. And the kind of church that changes a community is the kind of place that tells people, hey, you're not just welcome, but we actually want you to be a part of what we're doing. Now, it leads to the second thing you see in this passage. That's the kind of church that changes its community is a place where transformation is not just talked about, but experienced. Which look what happens next in verse 14. Then Jesus ordered him, don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony. It's interesting, the very first thing Jesus tells him to do is something he doesn't want him to do. He says, I don't want you to tell anybody about this. Now, if that had been some of us, like the very first thing we would have done, right? We'd get on Facebook, put this lengthy post about this incredible encounter we'd had with Jesus, or maybe you get on Instagram and you put, the before and after pictures and hashtag, changed and clear skin or whatever you want to put, and we would let everybody know. But Jesus says, I don't want you to do that. Instead of telling everybody, I want you to go and show them. And let your cleansing be your testimony. That's why he had him go to the priest. I mentioned earlier it was the religious people who kind of oversaw this whole exiling process. And so if you wanted to escape exile, if you wanted to be welcomed back into the community, you had to visit the local priest, where the priest would put you through this inspection. And if you could somehow pass inspection, almost overnight, you would get back everything that had been taken from you. You get your job back, you could go back home to your family, you could hang out with your friends, you wouldn't have to, announce your arrival anymore. You could do all of the things that you couldn't do any other time. The other thing that was happening is if you could somehow pass inspection, is you would not just be welcomed back home, you would be welcomed back at the temple. And so you could go back to the place where God was said to live, and the door would be open, and you could reinitiate your relationship with God. That's why Jesus, rather than calling this a healing, calls it a cleansing. It was more than just physical healing. It was emotional, it was spiritual, and it was physical. It was everything that everybody's looking for. And then Jesus tells him, hey, it's not enough just to talk about this. So don't go tell everybody. You just show them. And the only way for you to show them is to go through this process. Now, if you grew up going to church like I did, or you've been involved in church any length of time, you know that most of the time we're better at talking about transformation than we are demonstrating that we've actually been transformed. I mean, every church talks about it, right? We know that. Every church says, through Jesus, anything is possible, and the Holy Spirit can transform you from the inside out and make you a new creation. We all talk about it. But do you know what captures the attention of a community? Not what we say, it's what we do. It's not another Bible study about transformation. It's not a new sermon series about here's the 5 steps to be transformed. It's none of those things. It's when the people involved actually begin to show that they've been transformed. It's when we begin to love each other as we love ourselves, when we begin to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's when the people around you actually start to take notice. That's what happened in verse 15. Luke tells us that once this man is cleansed, everybody in that little community realizes what's happened, and the other people who are suffering from other things, they want to experience what he's just experienced. So verse 15 says, yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But then you get to verse 16, and Jesus does something that on the surface of it seems really strange to us. Here's what it says, verse 16. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and pray. Here's the last thing I want you to write down. It's that a church that changes its community is a church where spiritual depth takes priority over numerical growth. Now, just so you know, what Jesus does in verse 16 goes against what every church growth consultant in history would tell you. Here's Jesus suddenly, he's got all these people coming from all these different directions. They want in on what he's offering. And instead of seizing that moment, instead of, calling his team together to try to figure out how to, leverage their momentum and, build this big organization, Jesus separates himself from the crowd. He goes to a lonely place. And it's something he does over and over again. Luke says he often did this. So every time you think Jesus is right on the cusp of launching this movement that's going to overthrow the Romans and restore the kingdom of Israel, he separates himself from the crowd and he goes to spend time with his Father. And the reason he did that is because Jesus remembered something that most of us often forget, and that's that when it comes to spiritual things, depth is more important than growth. Now, I know we live in a culture in which it's all about numbers, right? So it's all about test scores and your salary and the profit. I understand. And that same thinking can infiltrate a church. So, we got to have more people this weekend than we had last weekend. And this year's budget's got to be bigger than last year's budget. And we've got to have more baptisms and more social media followers and more groups. And I get all of that. So don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that numbers are unimportant, because they are important. I mean, we're in the business of making disciples, and if every number represents a person, then that's something that matters a lot. But make sure you understand that numerical growth is not the only thing that counts. In fact, it may not even be in the top 10 of things that do count. And rather than obsessing over that, maybe we should do what Jesus did and prioritize going deeper rather than just getting bigger. And the reason that's so important, you see this throughout the New Testament, especially when you get to the book of Acts, is that Jesus knew you can have growth with no depth. I mean, you don't have to look far to see that. There's lots of examples of that. But you can't have depth without growth. Healthy growth is always a result of depth. Now, with that in mind, let me ask you, how many times over the last couple weeks have you intentionally done something that would help you grow deeper in your spiritual life? Now, I don't know why we do this, but we overcomplicate this, just something awful. We get this like in every other area of life, right? I mean, if you want to get in better shape, it's not some complex process. It's you have to do more of the right things and less of the bad things, right? So I've got to go to the donut palace less and I've got to walk more. I mean, that's how this works. If I want my grades to improve, I've got to study. If I want my business to grow, I've got to work on my business. If I want to learn how to do some skill, I've got to practice that skill. None of this is complicated. But what happens is we forget that when it comes to going deeper in your spiritual life, there are certain things that you have to do. Things like prayer, worshiping with other people, being involved in some kind of group, studying your Bible. All of those things are the things you have to do. And then as you do them, you begin to develop the kind of depth that God can use to bring growth. Now, as a church, we've been blessed to experience some significant numerical growth over the last couple years. At a time when researchers will tell you that church attendance and church involvement are in a dramatic free fall. It's gotten so bad, they've just recently given it a name. So a couple weeks ago, I talked about the Great Awakening. It was this revival that took place and just really changed the fabric of our nation. They've since named this period that we're in the Great De-Churching. So we had the Great Awakening, 1800s. Now we're in the Great De-Churching. Just this past week, The Atlantic magazine ran an article with this headline: "The misunderstood reason millions of Americans stopped going to church." And in the article, they said some of it's our fault, which is probably true, but they said the primary reason that so many people have stopped going to church, and this is really profound, make sure you catch this, is because it's easier not to go to church. So the reason most people don't go to church is the same reason a lot of us don't go to the gym, right? It's easier not to. And that's what they found. So somehow, even though we're fighting all those same challenges, we've been able to weather some of that. And we've got a lot more people coming this summer than we had last summer, and a lot more people this summer than we've had the last several summers. But here's the challenge in all that. For a church to go deeper, you have to go deeper. Make sure you get this. We're not like, I know we mess this up, but we're not sitting inside the church. This is just a building. The church is us. So if you want the church to go deeper, and that means you got to go deeper. Now, that being said, before I finish, there's one thing I want to share with you. My favorite part of this story. So if you've tuned out the last few minutes, I want you to tune in just for a couple minutes. One of the things I love about this story is that it's not just a story about some guy that gets healed, and it's not just a picture of what a church could be and should be, although it's both of those things. That's not all it is. Instead, it's a story, probably more than any other story in this chapter, that includes you and it includes me. So one thing the Bible teaches is that you and I, just like the dude in this story, have been infected with a disease, and it's a disease that's much worse than leprosy. The Bible calls it sin, and it is endemic, not just in Central Florida, but everywhere. And it says that all of us are sinners, all of us have been separated from God, and just like those with leprosy were separated from the community, sin separates us from God. And the problem is, just like the guy in the story, there is nothing we can do to solve that problem. So there's no pill you can take, there's no cream you can rub on, there's no surgery you can have, there's no inpatient rehab that you can go to. There is nothing you can do to solve your own problem. And some of you know that because you've spent a lot of your life trying to solve a problem and nothing's worked. That's where the guy in this story was. No matter how much he wanted to or how hard he tried, there was nothing he could do to solve his own problem. So one day he mustered up the courage to go into this little village where he'd heard about what Jesus had done for other people, and he was desperate to find out if what Jesus had done for other people he could do for him. And keep in mind, he didn't even know if it was true. He just hoped it was true. And so he goes and wants to find out. And that may be where some of you are right now. The truth is, I hate to break this to you, but just so you know, the Atlantic was right. I mean, it would have been easier not to be here today. I mean, you could have slept in, you could have watched Netflix, you could have done whatever it is that you like to do. But the reason some of you are here is because deep down inside, there is some part of you that hopes this is true. That hopes that what Jesus has done for other people, or what you've heard about him doing for other people, that he can do for you. And you know that what you're currently doing is not working. And so there's at least this small part of you that wants in on what Jesus offers. And if that accurately describes where you are and how you're feeling, I want to draw your attention to just one simple thing in this passage that's easy to miss, and yet it has the potential to change everything. If you go back to verse 12, all the guy in this story does is ask Jesus to touch him. That's it. And you get to verse 13, and it says, Jesus reached out his hand, and he touched the man. He said, I'm willing, be clean. And then Luke adds sort of this staggering comment that's easy to miss. And he says, and immediately the leprosy left him. Now, here's what I make sure you understand. The guy in the story, the leper, didn't do anything to earn this. It's not like he said, hey, Jesus, here's all the things I've done that I think you should reward me with. He doesn't do any of that. There was nothing he could do to earn it. Just like some of you, he had already exhausted all of his options, and it wasn't until he came to the end of himself and he realized that the only option he had left, and the only one he hadn't tried, was to place himself at the mercy of somebody who was more powerful than he was. And it was then, in response to one simple request, that Jesus reached out and touched him. And that's the part of the story that would have blown the minds of the religious guys. The religious leaders lived in a world in which if somebody was clean and they got too close to somebody that was unclean, that would contaminate them. And then the unclean person would make the clean person unclean. But then Jesus comes along. He says, no, it's not how it works. Instead, the clean person touches the unclean person and makes them clean. And it's a total opposite of what every religion in the world teaches. And yet the way Luke explains it, all it took was one touch from Jesus. And this guy with leprosy was not just healed, but he was cleansed. It's a picture of the way salvation works. The Bible makes it clear, the only thing you contribute to your own salvation is the sin. The only thing you bring to the table is your messed up self. And if you'll humbly acknowledge that, the clean person can make the unclean person clean. Now, some of you are here, and you've reached a point where that's what you need to do. You've already exhausted all your other options, and now the only thing left for you to do is to ask Jesus to take the mess that is your life and do for you what you can't do for yourself. Earlier, I told you a story about this 54-year-old guy in Florida that's been diagnosed with leprosy. I told you that thankfully today it's different. Today, you get leprosy. It's not a death sentence. You just go, you get some antibiotics, you get some steroid cream. In a couple weeks, everything clears up. But the doctors are careful to say that if you don't do those things, like you say, I don't want to take antibiotics, I don't want to rub any cream, I'm not going to do any of that, then this will kill you. And that's how it works. You'll be disabled and then you'll die. I want you to imagine how ridiculous it would be for somebody diagnosed with leprosy in 2023 to decide, you know what, I'm not going to take the medicine. I'm just going to do this on my own. You know how the story would end. And yet, that's what a lot of us do. We know how this ends. We know how sin ends. We know we've been infected with this deadly disease. And yet, week after week, when we're offered the cure, we turn away and we go do our own thing. And then we wonder why it doesn't work. If that's your situation, don't do that. There is a cure for the sin disease, but it's not a pill. It is a person. And his name is Jesus. So if you're here and you need to call on him to cleanse you, we'd love to help you do that. Others of you may be ready to take the next step, which is baptism. There's not a better picture of what it means to be cleansed anywhere than baptism. We had 2 last weekend. Both were beautiful. The old you is buried in that watery grave. The blood of Jesus washes away your sins, and you come out of that baptistry a new creation. And some of you haven't done that, and that may be the missing piece. It's hard to take the next step until you take the first step. And there may be a few of you here who have already done those things, and you just want to be a part of a place that tries to help other people do those things. Last week I mentioned there's some people here that are here every weekend, and if you ask somebody asks you, hey, where do you go to church? You say, First Christians is where I go, but you've never officially joined the team. If that's your situation, and you feel like you're ready, we'd love to have you. So I want you to stand, and we're going to sing a couple final songs together. And if you want to pray with somebody, you have questions about what your next step should be, I'm here, David's here, Austin's here. We'll be glad to meet with you, to talk with you. We'll take as long as it takes. We won't do anything to embarrass you. You just come and meet us on this front row. We'll be glad to help you.